Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center and Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety Pedestrian Safety Action Plan webinar series. Today is the first webinar of this 7-part series. Today's webinar is entitled Introduction to General Planning Principles with Peter Unn, Federal Highway Administration Resource Center Safety Engineer, Ryan Snyder, President of Ryan Snyder Associates, and Paul Zykofsky, Director of Land Use and Transportation Programs with Local Government Commission. My name is Davian Anderson, and I'm the PBIC Communications Coordinator. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. I'd first like to say hello to today's speakers to make sure they are ready and everyone can hear them. Peter, are you there?
I am.
Ryan, do we have you on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
And Paul, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Attendees, if you can hear me and if you can hear our speakers, click the hand in the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to raise your hand so that we can be sure our audience can hear us. Okay, great, and it looks like our audience is able to hear us. So I'll go ahead and move forward. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to go over a few administrative details and the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, please reload the website and log back into the program. You'll be able to rejoin the session. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on this call, so by muting your audio, it helps us to cut down on confusion and background noise. As an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the double arrows. So you won't be able to speak. You will have the ability to ask questions by entering them in the question box. If you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here. I'll monitor these questions and respond to you if I'm able. Questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time in the question box, but will not be addressed until the end of the program, when we have built in about 20 minutes for a discussion period. Please feel free to ask those questions as we go along, and we'll get to them after the program. Also, when you exit the webinar, there's a very brief survey that will pop up. We would very much appreciate your feedback on our performance. Following today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email. This email will be sent 1 to 2 days after the presentation and will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1.5 hours of instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, please forward this link to the other participants so that they can download and print the certificate with their name. Before we get started with today's program, I want to give everyone a little information about the webinar series. The goal of the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan webinar series is intended to help communities address pedestrian safety issues and initiate the steps to drafting a tailored pedestrian safety action plan. Modeled after the Federal Highway Administration and PBIC's in-person training course, How to Develop a Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, this free webinar series will cover topics ranging from funding to safety enforcement. The next webinar in the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan series is scheduled for Wednesday, May 4th, 2011 at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. This webinar is entitled Involving Stakeholders and will be presented by Peter R.O.W, Senior Planner with Tool Design Group. Please visit www.walkingInfo.org/webinars to register for this webinar and future ones in the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan series. The 7-part series was developed by the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, a national clearinghouse of pedestrian and bicycle-related safety information and resources. We offer information and technical assistance to diverse audiences about health and safety, engineering, advocacy, education, enforcement, access, and mobility as it relates to pedestrians and bicycles. The PBIC today's webinar are both made possible with funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration. This session will also be archived and available for download at www.walkingInfo.org/webinars. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at walkinginfo.org/training. Now I'm going to turn the screen over to Peter Unn for the feature presentation, Introduction to General Planning Principles. While he's getting set up with his slide presentation, I want to take a quick hold from the audience. Please let us know how many participants are viewing the webinar at your site. Okay, I'm going to give everyone a few more seconds to answer that question. And I do want to thank you for answering that polling question. At this time, I'm going to pass the screen over to Peter Unn. Before we get started with the presentation, I would like for our presenters to tell us a little bit about their background. We'll start with Peter.
Great, Damien. Yes, welcome everyone. And once again, Peter Unn, Federal Highway Administrator. I'm with the Resource Center. I'm actually located in Olympia, Washington. I'm what they call an alternate duty location employee. But I work on the Resource Center Safety and Design Technical Service team. I'm a safety engineer and been with Federal Highways for coming up on 13 years now. And once I pass it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Peter. I'm a transportation planning consultant based in Los Angeles. We prepare bicycle plans, pedestrian plans, a lot of safe routes to school plans, and I teach these courses for Federal Highway Administration as well as complete streets trainings and so forth.
All right, and Paul?
Sorry about that. This is Paul Zykofsky. I'm with the Local Government Commission in Sacramento. We're a nonprofit that's been promoting walkable communities for many years. And like Ryan, I've been teaching these courses from the very beginning, as well as Safe Routes to School and Complete Streets workshops.
Thank you, Paul. And we'll take questions at the end. Peter, please take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Devian. Well, I'm really excited about this series we're doing on how to develop pedestrian safety action plan. One of the reasons is just a great course, and many of you guys, maybe there's some people out in the audience that have taken this course before in the live sessions, and we always get great reviews. I'm really glad that we're able to do this via the web. But the other reason I'm excited for this course is because we've got a great group of presenters lined up for you, and two of them being Paul Zykofsky and Ryan Snyder, who they're going to be tag teaming today for the planning and street elements of the pedestrian safety in this first session. And as Devian sort of quickly went over, this is just a series overview where we're going to be, it's a 7-part portion series, and you know, I think we got the first 4 sessions lined up, as Devian mentioned, and then hopefully you sign up for the email to know when all the dates are, and we hope that we have a good attendance in each of these. And just a quick note, on the engineering session, Module 6, this is a condensed version from the Designing for Pedestrian Safety series, which we've already completed. And you can find the link to those recorded webinar sessions on the PBIC webinar webpage. And I think when Debian, if they download this particular PowerPoint slide, are your slides going to be coming up as well so they can have those links? Debian? I don't know if your phone's on mute, but I can't hear it. Hopefully you'll be able to get those links as well. So, and just a quick, just a quick overview with regards to the outcomes for this series. Now, we've designed this training so once you finish, you'll have the knowledge to develop and implement a pedestrian safety action plan that's really specific to your agency's needs. We're not at the end of this series. Obviously, you're not going to have a draft plan, but you'll have the knowledge to do that. And you'll also be able to describe how pedestrians should be considered and provided for during the planning, the design, the work zone, the maintenance and operation phases. So really, it's from the cradle to the grave. In all the different phases, we should be considering pedestrians. You'll also be able to describe how human behavior affects the interaction between pedestrians and drivers. And finally, you'll be aware of the good practices and the effective solutions to enhance pedestrian safety and accessibility. Okay. Just a little bit of data. In recent years, the average number of pedestrians killed in traffic-related crashes about 4,000. I say recent years because that number has dropped a little bit. You know, we've been, for various reasons. We'll talk maybe a little more about that in the next couple of slides. With regards to injuries, it's about 59,000. Now, these 4,000 plus lives represent about 12% of all traffic-related tragedies. Okay. Now, you know, something we give numbers out, we give stats and data, but you know, we're really talking about people, and that's something that I would always like to have people remember whenever we're doing safety training, is that we're talking about people's lives, and maybe it's somebody that you knew. Okay. Now, most crashes occur when pedestrians are crossing the road, So really there's a good focus on crossing countermeasures. And most fatalities and serious injuries occur on roads designed with little attention for pedestrian safety. And pedestrians are rarely killed in walkable environments. So the plans and designs that you develop today, they're going to influence how safe, people feel, but also more importantly, how they respond. And so, we want to, that's why this is so important, is to get those designs right, to get people to react in the way that we want them to. Now this graph shows pedestrian fatalities on the downtrend, which is it's a positive. However, the graph doesn't tell why the numbers have been dropping. And although we believe there's various safety plans have been developed in these last 5 or 6 years and so forth, maybe even longer than that. Maybe some of your agencies have been doing this for quite a while, but those plans have helped to get the numbers down. But some people wonder, maybe the numbers have been coming down because there's maybe less people walking. The roads have been getting, in some areas the roads are pretty bad, and maybe people are feeling less safe, and so there's less walking going on, maybe, and therefore fewer fatalities. There is some research going on in this area to decide, determine what the factors are. And this is the injury trend line. It's not as clear of a pattern. And the 2009 data isn't shown on this graph, but we do have the 2009 data, and it came in at 59,000, as was mentioned earlier. And so we are back on the downtrend, and hopefully it stays that way. And but it's still way too many lives that are being impacted. And something else that we should remember is the American with Disabilities Act, or ADA requirements. When people are injured, we do need to provide facilities that are capable, people in wheelchairs and for the blind. And so we will be discussing a little bit about ADA as well through this series. So why is it important to accommodate pedestrian safety and accessibility? Well, whether for pleasure or exercise or just getting somewhere, most people make a walking trip in a day. Maybe it's just from your parked car to the entrance of the building. But walking is the oldest form of transportation, and at some point we all are pedestrians. Another important reason to accommodate pedestrians is because a large segment of our society, doesn't drive, or maybe they can't drive. It's whether they're disabled, maybe they can't afford a car, maybe they're, those under 16, there's kids, they don't drive. But then there's a good portion of the population that just chooses not to drive as well. Maybe for, due to gas prices or, high cost of parking, various reasons. But somebody did a calculation once, and, based on the census, and they figured out that about 33% of the population doesn't drive. So if you're not considering pedestrians in your designs and your plans, really you're leaving out about 1/3 of the population. Now, there's other modes of transportation, like transit, that's dependent on good walking environments. And so, basically all transit trips begin and end with a walking trip. So we really need to pay special attention around these areas. A good walkable urban environment is good for business as well. Here in Olympia, many of our, in our office they'll take a break down to the coffee shop, or go out for lunch. And in Olympia, we have a good walking environment, and so we can do that. But I know that in some offices where I visited and talked to people, it's, they don't go out very much. They'll actually jump into a car to go get coffee or go to lunch because they really don't feel safe walking to their destinations. And so, once again, the designs that we, what we design and how we plan things and what we build will affect human behavior. Another reason to why to accommodate pedestrians is really health. Walking is a great form of exercise. And when can you not turn on the news and hear a story about the overweight problem in America? And creating a good walkable environment, can help that. And we're really partnering up with in a lot of agencies across the country. The health community is really jumping on board and supporting our efforts to create good walkable, safe environments. And really, we should we shouldn't be designing streets just for one group of users. Really, pedestrians are a vital element of the street design, as well as bicyclists and other modes. And so, pedestrians belong, as well as vehicles, but we need to accommodate all modes of travel. And so, the other aspect that I'd like to bring out is that for all, we say, because it's good for all, safer for all road users, the different countermeasures that we'll be presenting throughout this series, not where there's an imbalance of, making it unsafe for one mode versus another. All the safety countermeasures that we're going to be talking about for pedestrians, it doesn't make it less safe for vehicles. And so really it is, in some situations, it's a win-win situation. And so especially in the engineering countermeasures, for example, the protected left turns, it's a win-win for pedestrians as well as for vehicles. Okay. So really it makes it safer for all road users. And then AASHTO, many of you who do designs know the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. They have a green book, and in this green book it says, because of the demands of vehicular traffic in congested areas, it's often extremely difficult to make adequate provisions for pedestrians, yet this must be done because pedestrians are the lifeblood of urban areas. And so really, agencies are on board realizing that we do need to accommodate pedestrians. And finally, really, it's because it's the law. And Secretary LaHood, out in on March 15th, sent out this policy statement with regard to bicycles and pedestrian accommodation. And it's really every transportation agency has the responsibility to improve conditions and opportunities for walking and biking, and they need to integrate walking and bicycling into their transportation systems. Okay, and basically this policy statement, these are the highlights. It says you need to consider walking and bicycling as equal modes with other transportation modes. Pretty bold statement, but the Secretary stands behind this, and it's a changer, game changer, basically, this policy. So, but we need to also ensure that convenient choices for people of all ages and abilities, and going beyond just minimum design standards. Really, we always remind engineers that although funds are tight and they say we can't, we need to go with the minimums. Really, you do need to look at going beyond to really make an impact on safety. So, and collecting data on walking and biking trips, we've been doing that for cars for a long time now, but we want to do that for the pets and bikes. And maintaining sidewalks and shared paths the same way that we do for vehicles, especially during snowy weather, and then to improve non-motorized facilities during maintenance projects as well. These are some of the resources that you can go to with regards to getting this information. The walkinginfo.org website, as was mentioned, it's the clearinghouse for safety. The Federal Highway Safety website, #2, as well, has a lot of great information. And it's on the education and enforcement components, ITE and AASHTO. So go to these websites, check them out. All the information that we were presenting and more can be found at these websites. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Paul and Ryan, and they're going to talk about the planning and street design elements, the land use, the street connectivity, access management, site design, and level of service. Your phone may be on mute, possibly.
No, I've got it here, except...
There you go. Thanks.
Okay, show my screen. Unfortunately, my PowerPoint just crashed, so I'm going to have to reopen it. Sorry about that, folks. Maybe you want to take it back and start when we'll start with you advancing the slides, Peter.
Yeah, Debian, can you send it back over to me then?
The one thing you don't want to have happen when you're doing a webinar just happened, which is PowerPoint, trusty PowerPoint just crashed on me. So let me just open that up again, and hopefully this time it will stay open. Okay. Let's go. Okay. Oh, geez.
You want to just
okay? I think Peter, you're going to have to just advance the slide. Sorry about that, folks. In fact, now my screen is totally blank. Okay, so let me just close that out. So I'm not seeing the screen, your screen, Peter. Are you going to be advancing the slides?
I will be, yes.
Okay. And are those up on the screen? Because I'm not seeing them.
By chance, do you have a printout of the PowerPoint?
Okay. Let me close out.
Maybe I could start going through these slides.
Okay. Why don't you take over, Ryan? Let me try to open this in the interim.
Okay. All right. This next piece is regarding land use and its significance to walkability. Why do we have cities? The reason we have cities is really to minimize travel and maximize exchange. So having land uses close together where people can walk makes for a walkable environment. When things are located far apart, it necessitates getting into cars. How we built our roadway system. Our roadway system, to a large degree in many areas, particularly in suburban areas, has been to facilitate travel over longer distances. We've created these wide, large arterials that transport people long distances, but we have, in the meantime, sort of forgotten the destinations themselves. Reducing travel demand can really be best regulated by changing land use policy. When we think of transportation, it's really movement from one land use to another. So the way we arrange land uses impacts the way we travel, whether it be from home to work or home to school or from work to the store. Arranging these land uses in a way that facilitates walking is really the first part of transportation planning and creating walkable neighborhoods and communities. So when we've segregated land uses and created things, land uses that are far apart, one of the things we can start to do to retrofit is to start to allow small-scale retail into neighborhoods, to reintroduce neighborhood schools, and to reintroduce some neighborhood parks. With neo-traditional development, sometimes called new urbanism, goes by a number of different names. We're trying to get back to the way that things used to be done when cities were developed under the assumption that people would walk wherever they go. So destinations are close to residential areas. Schools and parks and stores and work sites are all close to one another. And that's what we're trying to do with this sort of new smart growth or new urbanism. Street connectivity is a really important part of this. The DNA of our cities is really our land use planning and our street network. So street connectivity is really, it's the bones of our communities. And what's best is interconnected streets with small blocks. In this example here, we can see how connectivity creates a pedestrian-friendly street system by reducing the walking distances and offering more route choices and dispersing traffic, as compared with the lollipop pattern or the cul-de-sac suburban model, where things are separated and to get from one place to another, one has to go along a circuitous route, as we see in the diagram there. And so what happens so often is that people would, instead of walking from home to the school or to the destination, would get in a car and drive. So this puts more cars on the street. This travel pattern also necessitates going through more intersections. And the more traffic we dump onto these fewer streets, the more hazardous these intersections are. So someone would have to make 3 left turns. If someone were on a bicycle, those would be busy intersections, and probably many people are not going to bicycle, particularly younger children. There is a way to help to retrofit some of these cul-de-sac neighborhoods. In some areas like Davis and other communities, they're actually creating new links between the ends of the cul-de-sacs. And this does help reduce the walking distances, so things are close enough where people can start to walk. It offers more route choices. The main disadvantage that this has, it still does not disperse traffic, so the cars are still going to be dumped onto a smaller number of larger streets. When we have high connectivity, we don't need many travel lanes, so we can keep traffic dispersed and we can get by in many places with just 2-lane streets. However, when we start to have less connectivity and fewer streets, excuse me, we need larger streets, we need more turn lanes, and they become more difficult for pedestrians to cross, and they become faster streets. When we get to the lowest level of connectivity, we're in a situation where we have dumped all of the traffic onto a very small number of streets, and so we've got these wide, high-speed boulevards and arterial streets with many travel lanes and wide streets and turn lanes that are extremely difficult to cross, and they would also have few points for people to cross. And then that leads us to a situation where we'll have these intersections of these large streets, and these kinds of intersections are very difficult for really anybody to cross. They're not only more dangerous, but they're less inviting, and certainly when we think of our more vulnerable users, whether that be children on their way to schools or senior citizens who walk slowly or disabled people, these kinds of intersections really become barriers that many people will not dare to try to cross. In Davis, they've used sort of a different model where some of the new developments have created a network of trails between the cul-de-sacs. And so this has done something that actually you can get around Davis pretty well on bicycle or by foot without having to use the streets. So this is a pretty good situation where they've got good connectivity for pedestrians and for bicycles. It still has the disadvantage of having a smaller number of streets, so traffic itself is not dispersed. It's still concentrated along a few streets, so it's not ideal. But this system works fairly well, and it actually takes a pretty significant number of auto trips and converts them to bicycle and pedestrian trips, so captures many of those.
Hey Ryan, this is Paul. I can see the screen.
You're back up and running now? Okay.
Back up and running, yeah.
Okay, I think we're just about ready to go to your slides.
Exactly. Okay, and if you want, I can do the next 2 modules, and we can go back and forth a bit. Access management is another really important thing to think about when you're considering pedestrian safety, because every single driveway is going to be a potential conflict. And in this image, we see some pedestrians who've just passed the driveway where one of them actually was almost hit by the motorist exiting that driveway, because that motorist was looking in the direction of oncoming traffic to her left and didn't think about the possibility of pedestrians coming to her from the right. So this is always something that we have to think about, and these driveways present some real hazards. So at these access management points, drivers and pedestrians have to make choices. Do I walk in front, as we see there's one pedestrian doing there, or do I, walk in back? And for the motorist, it's do I pull forward or do I back up? So you get this sort of dance that takes place when motorists are exiting driveways, which can create a real hazard. I guess the important lesson for anybody who's walking on the sidewalk by a driveway is to always make that eye contact with a motorist, particularly if you're coming towards that motorist from a position that they're not looking in. If they're looking left and you're coming from the right, don't walk in front of them unless you make sure they've seen you. So there's 2 techniques that we can use to try to address these conflicts. You'll notice on the left side of this image, all the X's are indicating the points of conflict at driveways, both with pedestrians and bicyclists. And with pedestrians, you notice there's 4 points of conflict for motorists both exiting from that driveway as well as motorists entering into that driveway. So that's a significant number of potential conflicts. So there's two ways to address that. One is to try to consolidate driveways. You know, by consolidating the driveways, you, instead of having 3 driveways here that each have 4 conflicts, we're actually you know, reducing that to only 4 instead of 12, let's say. Of course, the challenge is getting businesses and property owners to consolidate a driveway is not easy to do. It does take some real effort. Most landowners, property owners, once they have a driveway, are reluctant to give it up. It does happen occasionally, and it's something you do need to work with your property owners to try to do, particularly on streets where you have a lot of driveways. The other way to address these conflicts is to put in a median. What the median does is it eliminates both the left turns out from the driveway as well as the left turns into the driveway or into that property. By doing that, instead of having 4 conflicts at that driveway, you reduce them down to 2. Now, Ryan, we both, I guess, asked folks in our classes, you know, which do you think has the greatest crash reduction factor, putting in the median or consolidating the driveways? And I often tell folks it's a bit of a trick question because we haven't really gotten into the substance of the course, which will give you the answer. But what's been your experience in terms of what people usually guess here?
Most people guess the medians.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had a mix of reactions. I think, you know, sort of the simple answer is often to consolidate the driveways, but typically it's actually the medians that are more effective because it's the left turns where we end up seeing more pedestrian crashes. And that's why ultimately, if you're going to try to address this problem, putting in a median is going to reduce pedestrian crashes by a greater factor than consolidating driveways. And it's also, you consider it, it's actually easier to put in the median because it's in the public right-of-way. You're not having to basically work with property owners to try to consolidate driveways. Although, of course, property owners will also object if you put in medians that make their access to their property more difficult.
Yeah, that's what's going to make this whole, you know, both of these solutions a little more challenging, is the property owners wanting their access.
Exactly, and it's something you have to negotiate with them. And I think the one thing about putting in the median, which I think also is very important, is it really does add to the beauty of the street. It gives you a place to put in landscaping, makes it a more attractive street, and those are some of the trade-offs I think that you can discuss with property owners in trying to promote these types of solutions. So we just talked about how important connectivity is and how we want to avoid basically breaking connectivity, although there are occasions when that will be done. And if you have to do that, I guess the important thing to consider is that you want to try to maintain some connectivity for the pedestrians and folks that are not in their cars. So even if you were to, you see this image on the right where a non-traversable barrier has been put in, that really has broken connectivity. I like to say that, since pedestrians only walk at 3 miles per hour, if you make direction of travel much greater by blocking off a point of access, you really eliminated the chance that people in that neighborhood will walk to destination. It just makes it that much more difficult. So if we go to the next slide, you'll actually see some of the ways you can still restrict. Peter, can we go to the next? Yeah. Even when you do have to sever a street, as we see in these cases, or if you build with a cul-de-sac pattern, try to maintain connectivity at the end of those severed streets for pedestrians and bicyclists. So somebody who's walking or somebody who wants to get their bike out on the road doesn't have to go all the way around, and travel a much longer distance to get to their destination. And in the next
or even getting to a bus stop.
Exactly, bus stops are very important. Yeah, often on these types of roads, the bus stop will be maybe in the mid-block location or a place like that. And here we see an example of a city that has done that at the end of this cul-de-sac. Cars can't go through, but pedestrians do have access points. Earlier, Ryan, you showed that that image from the city of Davis in California, which is actually design neighborhoods so that at the end of the cul-de-sacs there are openings that connect to basically a trail system that gets kids and everybody to a lot of destinations, especially to the schools. And they've also built their system so that when those trail networks have to cross a major roadway, they'll often have an underpass or an overpass so that kids do not have to cross busy streets when they're on bicycle or walking. So, Ryan, do you want me to do this one?
Sure.
You took first two, and we can go back and forth.
You want to do the next two? Okay.
Sure. With site design, of course, what we're talking about here is really where the buildings go on the site. And for many years, we've seen buildings sort of set back farther and farther from the street, where the parking is put in front of the building. And this really is not a pedestrian-friendly design. It's not a particularly comfortable thing to walk by these types of properties. There's just a big expanse of asphalt out there. It's hot if you're in a warmer climate. It's just not conducive to encouraging people to get out and walk. And what really does entice people to do that is having something to look at, having storefronts and things closer to the sidewalk, as we see in this image, where the building is right at the back of the sidewalk, and as you're walking along, you actually have things of interest that engages the eye of the pedestrian and makes it a much more interesting and enjoyable and comfortable place to walk. Of course, part of that is also getting the street to behave. I've been told many times that when you have a big, wide arterial street with a lot of traffic and noise, the buildings are not going to feel comfortable being close to the street. So there is really a give and take there that goes on with the street. But by bringing the buildings to the back of the sidewalk, you start changing that street and slowing the traffic down, creating that sense of enclosure that really tends to work. And Ryan, I'm sure you've seen a lot of examples of this in your work, of where having the buildings in the right place can really make a big difference.
Oh, it makes a huge difference. I mean, it's not only convenient and shorter, but pedestrians don't have to cross the parking lot. But aside from that, I mean, there's a really strong intangible here, and that is this a place you want to be? I think this picture is the kind of community that you want to be. It's the kind of place that you want to get out and walk. It's the kind of place that you would travel to on vacation. It's the sort of neighborhood that you would bring your friends from out of town or out of state or out of country to visit and show them your community, as compared with the slide before, which is something that's completely uninviting. And it's not the kind of place where you would take your friends from France to visit in showing your community, or a kind of place you'd go on vacation. So it's just not a nice place to be. Walkable communities are inviting.
Exactly, and yeah, and this image here, one of the things that we're often challenged by is, land uses like fast food that want to have, the drive-through, is right between the sidewalk and the building. Again, this is not a particularly good design. We want to try to get the drive-through to not basically be in that line where people are walking into the store. I guess on the plus side, at least people coming out of those drive-thrus are going at a slow speed, so they're usually not likely going to hit somebody, but it can happen. But here's an alternative design. In this case, the same type of restaurant, which will go unnamed, is built right up to the edge of the sidewalk with an entrance from the sidewalk. And there is a drive-through, and we'll see it, I think, in the next image, but it's in the back on the side. It's not right in the front. So here you see where the drive-through access is. And it's not interrupting or getting in the way of people actually getting into the building, as they're having to traverse the drive-through lane.
To that unnamed restaurant.
Right, to the unnamed restaurant. And the next example is actually a pretty radical one here. There's actually a gas station convenience store behind this building. I mean, something we don't see very often, but we're starting to see some cities, particularly in the more urbanized parts of those cities, require or insist that if you're going to put a gas station, you don't have to have a big blank asphalt pad on the corner. You can actually locate behind the building. In this case, I have a sign right on the corner that people can see, and of course, folks who live there know where the gas station is. But this, of course, is a much more pedestrian-friendly gas station design than what we typically see around the country. Next. What we're also seeing more and more is retrofitting of shopping centers, and I've seen this in my work. I think it's part of as these shopping centers, which typically have a life of about 15, 20 years, or at least the building's life is not very long, get rebuilt. They have to take steps to meet ADA requirements, Americans with Disabilities Act. So they will retrofit their site to actually install a pedestrian access way to the building. So it's not it's not the ideal we'd like to see if the building's actually lining the back of the sidewalk, but at least we're starting to see a little bit more thought being given to how to get into the building from the sidewalk. And I don't know, Ryan, you got a lot of these types of uses down in Los Angeles. Are you seeing this kind of retrofitting over time?
I'm not a lot of retrofitting. I'm seeing some new buildings with some better designs. And certainly one of the things that can be done to improve this one is you see that Pedway is just really a striped crosswalk. Putting in a raised crosswalk would make that much better. I've seen designs, particularly in Vancouver, where walkways through parking lots like this actually are separated and have landscaping on either side of them. Mm-hmm. So just getting through the parking lot itself is a much different experience.
Yeah, and we're starting to see, you're right, I'm also starting to see new designs of shopping centers where they're really doing a much better job of really improving the pedestrian experience, of having walkways through, of having some shading and landscaping, breaking up the parking, so instead of having one big massive parking lot, you see sort of smaller groups of parking in different areas of the site. So I think although all those things are good ones, as long as there's good visibility for the pedestrian that's trying to get to the stores, I think that's important. But slowing down the speeds, raised crosswalks, all of those things can really help. Yeah. Next. So here's a large-scale development. Again, we'll go unnamed, where they've at least a lot of times you'll see these sidewalks that just end when they encounter the driveway for the big box store. In this case, they actually have provided a sidewalk all the way in from the street, which I think is commendable. Those are at least the types of things we want to see with some of these types of uses. And here's an example of poor design. In this case, you want to make sure that if you do have a parking lot, when you're exiting your parking space, you don't have to back up over the sidewalk where a pedestrian might be present. And I actually worked in a city in Northern California several years ago, and while we were there, a pedestrian was actually killed, not in a parking lot, but actually was angled parking where a motorist pulling out of a spot near a crosswalk actually hit a pedestrian. In this case, you can see, as the little note indicates, that they were so desperate for that one parking space that they cut down a tree there. Clearly, the tree should have stayed, and that parking space should not have been added, because it's not. You don't want to have drivers either backing up over a sidewalk or a crosswalk where they're likely to encounter a pedestrian.
If you'll notice in that picture, there's also a visibility issue with the shrubs there.
Yeah.
So somebody backing out of that parking space couldn't see a pedestrian walking by from that side.
That's right. Yeah. So a lot of things not to do in this slide. Next. So I'll continue here, Ryan, and then you'll pick up a little later. Yep. So I guess what we're really talking about with some of these things is rethinking the role of urban streets. We recognize that a lot of these issues are not ones that, say, the traffic engineer or public works department will be dealing with, but they're very important to creating walkable environments. And I'm sure all of you have heard the term complete street. And what we're talking about is really a street that accommodates all types of users, whether you're in a car, a bicycle, on a transit bus, walking, whether you're young, old, able-bodied or not. We really want to make sure that all the purposes of the street, and of course these are the streets are the public, owned by the public. It's public right-of-way. They need to provide for all these different uses. Mobility for all modes, access to destinations. It's how we get to different uses and needs in our communities. It's also a way to support businesses. If you have a great street that encourages people to linger and spend some time there, that supports thriving economic development and businesses in your community. And not to be forgotten is the last one, which is simply beauty. You want to make sure that you're doing everything possible to enhance the environment that people live in. Those are some of the intangibles, perhaps, but something that I think is also very important that needs to be considered with every treatment that we add to a street. We want to make sure that we're not making it a less attractive place. So this next set of images will show how you can actually transform a street and take a pretty, vanilla type street like this one, plain vanilla, just a lot of asphalt out there, not a lot of buildings comfortable near the street. So by, in this case, narrowing the lanes down a bit, and I think a lot more people are recognizing that 12-foot lanes are appropriate on freeways and at higher speeds, but in urban environments with speeds under 45 miles per hour, 10 and 11-foot lanes work perfectly fine. So you can narrow down the lanes a bit. We don't see any decrease in safety when we narrow down the lanes. We don't see any decrease actually in capacity of the roadway. But by doing that now, we have a little bit more space to make the street more complete, to add a bike lane. In this case, they already had a two-way left turn lane, but they've added sort of median sections in there and added the trees. They've actually treated the parking lane a little bit differently. It's no longer just a lot of a big expanse of asphalt. They've actually added in a different texture or treatment for that that parking lane. By doing that, it also makes the road feel a little bit narrower. You don't have that big expanse of asphalt that makes motorists feel they can travel at high speeds. Am I missing anything, Ryan, or did I catch most of the changes here?
I think you got most of it.
Okay. Yeah.
And adding in the shrub, the trees and so forth, create the feeling of narrowing of the street and slows cars down.
Exactly. Yeah.
And also the median island provides a better opportunity for people who want to cross the street.
Right. And I think folks will hear about this in the engineering section, but we find that the studies have found that medians, for example, reduce pedestrian crashes by, I think it's up to 40%. So that's an important thing to consider, especially on multi-lane roads like this one. Adding medians on those streets really can help. And of course, once that initial change to the roadway takes place, as I mentioned earlier, buildings now feel more comfortable coming up closer to the street. So we see new development, infill development as we call it, filling in those gaps, filling in the parking lots. And I think the next slide sort of shows the final transformation. Maybe it's one or two more. Where it only, the street now has life, safer for pedestrians. I guess the final comment would be, if it only would be this easy in real life as it is in Photoshop. But we are seeing these types of transformations all over the country, which really do create much more pedestrian-friendly environments.
They also create a lot of economic value.
Exactly. Yeah, something we often don't think about is how by investing in improving the street, the local jurisdiction will often get the payback multiple times in the increased property values and tax revenue of those properties along that street. So as I mentioned earlier, we recognize that these are things that may not be dealt with by road designers. But they're obviously very important things to think about, and it really speaks to the need for more collaboration between sort of public works and road designers and traffic departments and DOTs with planning folks who are the ones who are dealing with land uses and development. You really need to have that holistic approach, and that's often in complete streets. What we're trying to do is get those different departments to work together, to be thinking about all these things jointly, so that we end up with the best possible streets that a community can provide. And we have this question here. I think what we find when we go into a community and work with them is that often there are ordinances that support some of these things, but they may be scattered in a variety of different documents, and they may not be sort of clearly spelled out as emphasizing the need, as supporting pedestrian-oriented planning and design. And Ryan, I don't know if in your experience you find that more often than not, communities already have these types of policies.
Yeah, certainly most cities I work in in their general plans, have some pretty good policy language when it comes to creating walkable communities and pedestrian orientation. It really is a matter of sometimes not realizing itself through all of the zoning and the building codes,
mm-hmm.
and some of the sort of the more details that are needed to have it become reality.
Right. Right. I think, one of the things we encourage communities to do is to actually look through, their different planning documents, look through their street design standards, and make sure everybody sort of understands what's in there. And then if things are missing, then, develop the policies or the ordinances that are needed to fully support pedestrian-friendly design. I guess we can move on. Yeah, one last thing that I'll talk about, and then I'll hand it back to Ryan, is levels of service. I'm sure a lot of you, especially if you're in the transportation world, deal with that regularly, and how to think about that when it applies to street design and pedestrian safety. If we go to the next slide, we'll see a street that the highway capacity manual would say, wow, this is level of service A, little traffic, no impediments. The result when we start shooting for levels of service A, B, or C is we build these very wide roads that, in my opinion, I think a growing number of people's opinion, is a waste of money and resource. I think one of the big problems, I guess, we've had over the years with levels of service is that by setting up this A to F system, it sounds too much like a report card, and we just shy away, of course, from getting anything below a C, right? That's you're going to get in trouble if you come home with a report card that's a D or F. So we tend to be shooting for these very wide streets where most of the day, there may only be capacity, at capacity on this street during, say, the peak hour of the day, and the rest of the time you have this very wide street. So Ryan, I don't know if you want to comment on this. I guess we can go to the next image and then have a little bit of a discussion. The highway capacity manual also has a pedestrian level of service, and again, it would say this is A because there's no impediments. But in reality, we need a different way to measure pedestrian levels of service that really reflects the quality of the walking experience, because in fact, we enjoy walking in places where there is, where there are a lot of pedestrians, like we see in this image. Here we would say this is a pedestrian level of service of F, but it's exactly the kind of environment that we love, people love to walk in, where there's other people around, with things to, there's people watching, there's buildings to look at, there's a lot of activity. So I think you'll probably be hearing about this in the other sections of this series. There is, in the new highway capacity manual, there is a new multimodal level of service that does try to take into account how the design of the road impacts not just the movement of cars, but also how it impacts the experience of bicyclists and pedestrians. It's not perfect, it has its challenges, and I'm sure there'll be efforts to refine it as the years go on, but at least it is a step in the right direction that tries to balance the different modes and tries to address some of these concerns.
Yeah, with the new multimodal level of service, MMLOS,
mm-hmm.
They're actually considering, they've got an LOS for pedestrians, bicycles, and transit as well, and they're averaging bikes, peds, transit, and motor vehicle LOS to get the complete LOS. And then there could be cases where the LOS for the motorist might even decline a bit, as long as it improves for the other users. The overall average and the overall MMLOS may actually improve.
Exactly, right. And I guess the main point here is simply to not be, a lot of cities, I think, over recent years, I know my city in Sacramento some years ago, basically said, we will accept levels of service of E or F, in more urbanized parts of the city, because we recognize that, you can't build roads. If you build roads that are going to reduce levels, they're going to lead to a level of service of C, you end up with a road that looks like this. These very wide roads that really undermine the livability of a community. So I think that the big message here is that we have to start considering not just levels of service for all users, but also from vehicular levels of service, we need to start accepting E or F as okay. It's a norm. It doesn't mean you get sent to your room and you failed class. it's actually the reality of how communities are developed and built. So Ryan, if you want to pick up on this one, I
yes.
guess. Yeah.
Okay. Why are pedestrians at high risk on this street? I mean, as we can see, it's a very wide multi-lane road, which encourages quite a bit of speeding. Right now it doesn't have a lot of traffic on it, but I'm sure at other times of the day it does. We can see that there's a bus stop right here that someone might need to cross to. Someone might need to get from one side of the street to the other, and there's really no good place to cross here without walking a really long ways out of the way. So most people will end up driving and putting more traffic in the street.
Yeah, you'll notice also there's no way to access that parking lot from the bus stop.
Yeah.
You basically have to walk through the
walk through.
Yeah, to get there.
Pedestrians are at low level on this street for a number of reasons, really because the street is much narrower. There's a lot of activity on both sides. The stores are close to one another. There are people in the streets. There are bicycles in the streets. It's low speed, so there's a lot going on here, which just creates what traffic engineers call friction. So, and it's actually a nice environment, probably a better way to put it than friction in this case.
Yeah, and I think the issue again is speeds are so important for safety, not just for the pedestrian, but also the motorist. When we do this course live, we have these little videos from Australia which sort of emphasize the difference that a motorist in a car will feel when impacting at just a 5 km/h difference. So not only are we creating, improving safety for pedestrians and bicyclists and transit users, we're also improving safety for motorists. And this street is just a great street. I mean, it just has so much going on that street. Clearly the speeds are slow enough that the bicyclists just, ride in the lane. And what's interesting is there's very little engineering really on the street. You don't see, even lane markings.
Here, what is the core safety issue? And what tells the drivers that there are pedestrians? If we look at the characteristics of this, and this isn't a great pedestrian environment, but it's better than many. Some of the characteristics here are the fact that there's on-street parking, that the cross-section is reasonably narrow, the buildings are set right up to the sidewalk. They're close to the street. There are sidewalks, there's a crosswalk, and we actually have people there. So it does sort of signal to motorists that this is a place where you probably are going to have to slow down and watch for pedestrians. We can take a lot of streets and redo them, reinvent them. And there's quite a few techniques we can use. If we take this one, for example, take a good look at this. We're going to, with Photoshop, create some changes to it and try to keep in mind what this looks like when you see this next one. What changed in the new picture. So there's the old one, and here's the new one. And if we start to look at the things that changed, we can see that the utilities were undergrounded. There's a new raised median. We have narrow travel lanes, and we also have bike lanes. We also have much better sidewalks. We've got landscaping. So this street works much better for bicycles and pedestrians, and it's a much more beautiful street. The thing that didn't change, and this is important, was the number of lanes or the capacity of the street. So those things stayed the same, but it just became a much better street with these modifications.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually. I mean, some of these may look like high cost changes, but others could be fairly low cost. You could start out, for example, and transitionally just by changing the lane markings, and then over time you might add in the medians and the planting, the furniture strip between the sidewalks and the street. I mean, some of these things can happen at fairly low cost. I think the lane markings is sort of a very obvious one where anytime you're going to be doing any kind of resurfacing, repaving of the street, you have the opportunity, resealing, you have the opportunity to really think about how can we make the street more complete and safer and more accessible for pedestrians and cyclists by, for example, adding bike lane or even just an edge line that moves the motorist a little bit away from the sidewalk so pedestrians feel safer.
All right, guys. Well, great job. And this is the second to the last slide before, or actually the last slide before we get into questions. Maybe we can just do a quick recap, and maybe I'll throw this out to you guys. Or,
okay.
But why is it? We started out with the importance of accommodating pedestrians. Why is it important to accommodate pedestrian safety and accessibility?
Because we're all pedestrians. At some point in our journey, even if we're driving, we need to walk places, and it's a basic form of transportation. And again, the public rights of way should be accessible to all. Even if we're along a major roadway, there should be a way to be able to get around without having to be in a car.
Of course, nowadays we're dealing with all the issues related to health from people being inactive physically and climate change and all of these other things. We need to encourage walking.
Yeah, I think it's really recognizing that, yes, the car has had its heyday in the last 50, 60 years, but we still need to be able to get around without a car in our community. And as Ryan mentioned, the health impacts are significant. I mean, we have this major obesity epidemic in this country. We need to get people comfortable to be out walking more, and walking is a basic mode of transportation. The public health folks tell us, it's the best prescription a doctor can give a patient is to say, just get out and be more physically active, and walking is the way that most people will be able to achieve that physical activity.
And once again, it's good for business as well. So,
yep.
And other modes of transportation, such as transits and light rail, they're dependent upon it as well. So there's a good connection there. And I'll just jump in with being from the federal highway side. Really, it is the law. And the division offices, they can go out and do process reviews and seeing if on the federal aid projects that if you're using federal aid money, really you need to be considering pedestrians and accommodating them. And the language with Secretary LaHood having put out this new policy saying that they need to be considered as equal modes. And so really it is the law that agencies, and the shift is happening across the country. A lot of states are also adopting similar state policies that are that strong. So, great. Let's talk a little bit about the planning factors which influence pedestrian safety and accessibility. We can maybe recap some of those.
Sure. I guess I'll start out with the one I was supposed to do, which was land use. Obviously, that's not something that the traffic department or transportation department is going to be dealing with, but obviously very important to work with planning departments on where we locate different land uses, how they relate to the street. So now we start getting into some site design issues as well. Where do buildings sit? And I guess in recent years there's been a lot more attention to that. We now have a new way of using our codes to help do that, called form-based codes, which actually give us more control over where buildings will go on the site. So I'd say land use, site design. I'll see if I guess I'll leave the other two for Ryan to talk about briefly.
Well, again, I see the DNA of urban form as really being a combination of land use and our street planning. So I think you covered the land use piece pretty well, and just getting back to the street planning piece of it, making sure that you've got good networks and that you've got small blocks, that they're interconnected, and having a good street design manual that has good cross sections and gets into detail of what makes a good street and what makes a walkable street.
Yeah, and I think the connectivity piece is obviously really important, especially when developing new neighborhoods. Getting away from disconnected street networks, I think, is really important, keeping the blocks short. But then also in existing neighborhoods, often we're working in older neighborhoods, trying to find those connections, which sometimes are available through trail systems or just links between different land uses that might be helpful. And then finally, the last planning factor we talked about was access management. And that's, again, thinking about how do motorists and pedestrians interact at those driveways, at those points of access to private property where cars are entering and exiting, and how to try to treat those in a safer way. And as I mentioned, the median can be a very effective tool to reduce those challenges at those access management points. but also to help pedestrians get across the street, something you'll hear about in one of the future webinars.
And just another note on the medians, it is, or access management, it's a win-win, especially with vehicle crashes as well. So that's one of those great countermeasures. All right, well, great job, guys. The final bullet is the websites, which can provide all this information and more. And once again, we'll just state it's the PBIC website, which is www.walkinginfo.org. This series of recorded webinars are on there, as well as the Designing for Pedestrian Safety and many others. So we encourage you, that's the Safety Clearinghouse. And the other one is the safety.fhwa.dot.gov. And you can find some of the latest statistics, as well as a lot of great resources there as well. So with that, Vivian, I think we're going to conclude here right on time. So we'll leave about 20 minutes for Q&A. And so we'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. We now have time for some questions. Please enter your questions into the box on your screen. Again, if we run out of time for your questions, we'll attempt to answer it and get back to you after the program. Also, I do want to remind everyone that this is the introduction to the series. So if there are questions that can be answered later in the series, please feel free to defer those, and we can get to those later in the series. I'm going to move into our first question. The first question asks, do we have percentages of people who do not drive? And it says derived from the state of Virginia or even a locality or regional area. And I guess if we, is there a place they can find that information if we don't know?
Well, this is Peter Ryan, and where I sort of got that information is from the census, or one of the instructors, I should say, did a calculation based upon the census, and that's where they got it. So, but I don't know if there's a website. Maybe Ryan or Paul, if you guys know a specific website where maybe somebody does that calculation.
I think the census would probably have something about auto ownership. I know it has auto ownership. I don't know about the number of people that don't drive. It's somewhere to be found. It runs in my mind that it's on the order of 30 or 35% of Americans don't drive. I know it varies significantly from community to community. But I don't know, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers I've heard are the ones that that Peter presented at the beginning, which is a third of the population, including children under 16, don't drive. And then of seniors, I've heard the figure 21% of folks over 65 have given up driving. But I don't think I've ever seen a figure that actually states, just in the population area or by state, what percentage does not drive. I guess the place to look would be the National Household Travel Survey, which I guess USDOT does every few years. And that might be a place, place to at least start looking if you're trying to find that information.
Okay, great. We'll move into our next question. With the installation of the median, and I think this is referring to one of the earlier slides, with the installation of the median, wouldn't you still have the same number of potential conflicts as those left-turn drivers now will make U-turn somewhere and come back and make a right turn into the driveway?
Okay, so I guess the question, just to be clear, is that with the median, you're still getting those turns into the driveways. Yes, but I think the reason I said it was a bit of a trick question was that in subsequent webinars, there'll be more discussion about left turning movements and how that's where we see a larger percentage of pedestrian crashes. So even if you do have those motorists making U-turns and then coming into the driveways, they'd be coming in as right turning, and they'd be leaving as right turning movements, where we typically will see fewer of those crashes. Not only that, you also, as that diagram indicated, you've reduced the number of potential conflicts at those driveways from 4 to 2, because you now only have right in, right out, whereas before you had right in, right out, left in, left out. So I think overall, I think it's something that will be taken up a little bit more in future webinars, where we talk more about the types of pedestrian crashes we see and why the left turning movements do tend to predominate in those crashes.
Right turns are also slower, and in the diagrams we've eliminated some of the access points, some of the driveways as well.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Reducing the conflict points.
Yeah, I think I pointed out that with access management, the typical conflict as a motorist is looking in one direction, pedestrian is coming, from the other side. When you now only have right ins and right outs, because the motorist isn't crossing lanes, they're more likely to go at a lower speed. And I think that's, Ryan, you just mentioned the lower speeds. With right turns in and right out, you're turning into or out of, the nearest lane, so that you don't have the acceleration factor that motorists would be using when they'd be crossing lanes to get in or out of those uses or those parking lots.
Okay, thank you. We'll move into our next question. The question asks, we are about to develop a state PSAP. What techniques do you recommend for state DOTs to influence land use and setbacks in the ways that you discussed?
Excellent question. As everybody on the phone probably knows, typically land use and land use regulations are something that are regulated at the local level. However, and that's sort of sacred. There's very few local governments that are willing to give up that authority. However, I would say that you can make it, I guess at the state level, and it may require legislation as it did in California, you can make it easier for local jurisdictions to regulate where the buildings go on the site and to allow form-based codes. When form-based codes started in California some 7-8 years ago, there was some concern by some local attorneys, city and county attorneys, that this might not be a legal form of zoning. And as a result, we did adopt a state law that was passed, I forget the year, maybe Ryan, you remember, it was about 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah. That was signed into law by Governor Schwarzenegger, that basically said, yes, form-based code is a proper form of police control by local government, and locals can use that to regulate where the buildings go on the site. And I think the other area in which the state can help is simply by through good education, through good discussions with the locals on how to make communities more walkable and how to have better connectivity, better street networks, all those kinds of things that we've talked about. There is a give and take process there. I know some state DOTs years ago might have been planning, big bypasses. I've heard examples, for example, from New Jersey, where they were planning these highway bypasses, and then they realized that first they wouldn't probably have the resources to build those, but secondly, if they actually worked with the locals on improving the street networks, they actually could move the traffic through that community more slowly, more safely, and at much lower cost than building these big bypass projects. So I don't know, I may have gone a little bit afield from the question.
Yeah, I think there can just be quite a bit of cooperation between the state highway department or transportation department and the locals in doing their land use planning. This becomes particularly important in states like Virginia, where every street is part of the state system. Mm-hmm. Right. So there really needs to be a lot of cooperation. In California, we're rapidly becoming just our transportation department is really more of a freeway agency now, and a few local highways, but not so many.
Yeah, well, actually, I would say that there's still a lot of state roadways, state highways that are local. They're local main streets that come through small towns and so on. And that's probably true. I mean, that's true in California. I'm sure that's true in other places. But I think there are opportunities, especially there, for
cooperation.
Collaboration. The last point I would make on that is California has had an excellent program the last few years of providing grants to local governments to do better planning. This was started in the year 2000 with community-based transportation planning grants. It's a small amount of money. I think it's $1 or $2 million, maybe up to $3 million a year, that our state DOT actually puts out for competitive grants to local governments to do better land use planning, better access management, better street design, and so on, to again incorporate some of these approaches. So I think if your DOT is in a position to maybe help the locals do better planning, that's something else to consider, because especially small local governments often just really do not have the resources or the capability to do those plans.
Yeah, and Caltrans, the other thing that they've got is their context-sensitive design guidelines that that they are willing to apply in situations like rural highways and so forth, so their own design guidelines are sort of working with the locals.
Right. Any more questions, David?
Yes, let's move into the next question. This question references slide 69. It says the seven-lane roadway. What type of short-term solutions could you implement to improve pedestrian safety here?
Well, first of all, I would look to see what the traffic volumes are on that roadway and see if you really need that many lanes. I'll bet you that you could get by with the road diet and remove a couple of those lanes. The other thing that could be done is putting medians in and crossing islands and some pedestrian crossings every so often. And I think with the road diet, you could add in some buffers between the sidewalk and the road. You could probably put some bike lanes in. And all of those things are the type of things that would make it sort of a more hospitable environment and better for pedestrians to cross.
Right. Yeah, good point.
And aside from that, I mean, narrow the lanes themselves. I mean, these lanes are probably wider than they need to be.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we have a question from Brazil. It says, we are from Brazil, and here we have laws about traffic and traffic planning. People, including planners, how can you influence, I guess, laws surrounding pedestrian safety? Do you have any tips for this?
Wow, Brazil. Okay. Well, that's an awfully good question. I think, I mean, I grew up in Mexico, so I have a little familiarity with Latin American countries. I think there is a growing recognition, and a lot of Latin American countries have, higher percentages of people who are pedestrians to start with because, lower income levels, economic development issues, and so on. So to start out, you actually have a much larger base of pedestrians and transit users in developing countries like Brazil, Mexico, and so on, which I think gives you a bit of an advantage there because you haven't gone as in such an enormous way as we have in the U.S. towards transportation by cars. I think it's something to look at. I don't know the legal system and how this would be done, but I think clearly the kinds of policies that the U.S. DOT in the U.S. has adopted of saying we need to treat bicyclists and pedestrians on the same level as motorists, I think is a good start. And then I would look at what kinds of policies are out there that could help implement the kinds of treatments that you'll be hearing about through this webinar series. My experience in Mexico is that most multi-lane roads are typically built with medians in Mexico. It's rare to see a big road like the one we're seeing on the screen right now, this big monster without a median, which I think is a good practice already that's being done. Ryan, I don't know if you've traveled a lot in developing countries. What do you think? Yeah,
I think putting medians, first of all, your road design is always most important, making sure your road design is done in a way that doesn't encourage speeding and you've got good street networks and so forth, and putting medians in the middle if there are wide streets. But I think also having a legal framework that supports pedestrian right-of-way, and that there are stiff tickets given if somebody crosses in front of a pedestrian or hits a pedestrian, can go a long ways, and making sure that your streets are designed for lower speeds are some of the most important things that can be done.
Yeah, one of the points that I think will be emphasized over the course of these webinars is that by getting the design right, you're inviting proper use. By getting a street that naturally doesn't encourage high speeds, you're going to help create a safer street because motorists will not feel comfortable going as fast. We also have the benefit in this country of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which does say, it's a civil right that people need to have access to places. That's something else that other countries, if they haven't adopted similar laws, might want to consider. It's just sort of a bill of rights for folks who are not in cars.
And you know, the other aspect of all this is the education and enforcement component as well. The engineering being the long-term, and you know, that's what we encourage much. But we do, you know, in order to get the safety for pedestrians, we do have to look at a comprehensive approach, which ties in the education enforcement. And you know, in the United States, for a long time, pedestrian safety was sort of you know, it was what we called sort of the stepchild, you know, second to the vehicles. But of recent, it seems like because of a lot of the public has come to, you know, demand better facilities. You know, there's been grassroots movements throughout the country saying, you know, we want better places to walk and to, you know, the livability issue. And so I think it is talking to your you know, politicians and letting them know that you know, you want better facilities, and therefore then they will talk to, you know, the various DOTs. And but the education component being a very important component as well.
Okay. We'll move into the next question. What is an effective way to prevent vehicles from cutting short the right turn radii from a driveway?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Davian?
Absolutely. What is an effective way to prevent vehicles from cutting short the right turn radii from a driveway?
Okay, if I understand, I guess is it the radius that they're asking about there?
Yes.
Right turning radius?
Yes.
Yeah, that's something, you know, again, I think the engineering portion of this webinar we'll get into maybe briefly is curb radius, which basically the larger the curb radius, the easier it is for cars to go fast, and the longer the distance the pedestrian has to cross because you sort of set back at a larger sweeping curve. The important thing there, I think, and I'm not sure if I'm getting the question right, is to try to keep those curb radius as small as possible. And basically that's going to be a function of, you know, the design vehicle that's having to make those right turns and things of that sort. But particularly at driveways, it seems to me those radii can be kept fairly tight, because even if a large vehicle has to exit that driveway, they often will have multiple lanes to turn into. It becomes a little bit more challenging at intersections where you might have, you know, larger trucks making right turns. But even there, we do discuss how to keep the radius as small as possible by turning, you know, if you have multiple lanes, turning that vehicle into a second lane. If you have bicycle lanes and parking, looking at the effective radius as opposed to the actual radius of the curb, things of that sort, which will keep that curb radius as small as possible and slow motorist exiting, and also keep the crossing as short as possible. I don't know if Ryan, did you want to add anything to that? I think I understood the question, but if in case I didn't, please let me know.
Okay. Can the reductions in ADT be quantified by specific improvements in pedestrian facilities? Is there any rule of thumb for this?
Whoa. Okay. Ryan, are you still here, or did you have to leave? Ryan, I know, had to go to another meeting. I think, you know, that we still need to do, I think, more research on that. I think we do tend to see trends, you know, where we're in an environment that is walkable, pedestrian-friendly, transit-friendly. ADTs will typically be, you know, will typically drop. I don't know that we have any rule of thumb that can say, you know, if you build this pedestrian infrastructure, your ADT will go down. You know, average daily traffic will go down by X amount. Did I get that question right, David? Maybe you want to repeat that just to make sure I caught that.
Okay, let me scroll back to that question, and I can repeat that for you.
Yeah, please.
While you're doing that, Davian, I mean, there is the concept where, you know, having slower traffic doesn't necessarily mean that your ADT has to go down.
Right.
Often you know, when the 45-mile-per-hour speed is sort of an ideal speed because your gaps are shorter and your headways, and so therefore you can actually continue to, and depending on your intersections and your progressions, you can actually get quite a few of the, you know, you can keep your ADTs, keeping, you know, cars moving while still having good pedestrian design.
Right, exactly. Do we want to go on to the next, David? I hope we've answered that. If not, we can certainly.
Okay. If not, we can follow up after the program. All right, and it looks like we have time for about one more question. So it looks like the next question asks, sorry, we got some feedback there. Apologize for that. Have you found that traffic circles and or roundabouts are effective in traffic calming rather than using signalized intersections?
Yeah, that's an issue that maybe, I don't know if it's taken up in this course. We're getting some echo here, David.
Yeah, it seems like we're getting some feedback.
Okay, that's an issue that is not taken up in this series. It is discussed in the Designing for Pedestrian Safety course that I think there was a webinar series on before this one. But roundabouts in particular are talked about for several reasons. One is we do see a reduction in crashes typically because motorists are having to slow down, and because we have far fewer conflicts at roundabouts than we do at a typical intersection, signalized or stop controlled. So the research so far has shown I think it's about a 30 to 40% reduction in crashes, and I think up to maybe 70, 80, or even higher percent reduction in injury crashes. Because again, as a function of the speed, motorists are having to enter roundabouts at a slower speed. They typically, if it's a well-designed roundabout, you can have a very safe pedestrian crossing, especially if it's a one-lane roundabout, because pedestrians only having to cross one lane of traffic at a time. The challenge with roundabouts is going to continue to be how to deal with the blind pedestrians, particularly multiple lane roundabouts. That's one that we're still studying. There's a National Cooperative Highway Research Program study looking at different treatments at roundabouts to accommodate blind pedestrians. Though I have been told anecdotally, there was, I guess, a traffic engineer in the city of Fresno who took some blind pedestrians out to a single-lane roundabout, had a model for them to understand how it worked, and once they understood that, actually felt much more comfortable crossing there. But that's going to be the challenge. But overall, the positive with roundabouts is we do see a reduction both in vehicular and pedestrian crashes, and they move traffic very efficiently. We actually see about a 30% increase in capacity with a roundabout over signalized or stop-controlled intersection.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, and if anyone is interested, that the Design for Pedestrian Safety webinar series is archived on www.walkinginfo.org/webinars, and if you just click into Design for Pedestrian Safety, each of the webinars out of that series has been archived there. I think that's about all the time we have for questions. I do want to thank Peter, Ryan, and Paul for their presentation today. If we did not get to your question, we will be addressing all of the submitted questions and posting them to the webinar page on our website. Once again, a recording and transcript of today's program, as well as a few of the PDF slides, will be available in about a week at walkinginfo.org/webinars. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar has ended. Again, we very much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. Thank you again to our speakers, Peter Unn, Ryan Snyder, and Paul Zykofsky. And thanks to all of you for attending today's PBIC and Federal Highway Administration Pedestrian Safety Action Plan webinar series. And thank you.